I built this company with my hands before my son could even hold a pencil. That's not a metaphor. I'm telling you exactly what it was. 41 years old, $200 in my savings account, one decent suit, and a business plan I'd written on the back of a grocery receipt. I walked into my first meeting with a potential client, and I talked for 2 hours straight. By the end of that meeting, I had my first contract. By the end of that year, I had a company. My name is Richard Calloway, and for 30 years, Calloway Industrial Solutions was everything I had. It started as a small logistics consulting firm out of a rented office the size of a walk-in closet. Then it grew, slowly, painfully, beautifully. We expanded into supply chain management, then infrastructure consulting, then procurement advisory for mid-sized manufacturing companies. By the time I turned 60, we had 214 employees across 3 offices and an annual revenue that I was proud of every single day I walked through those doors. I had one wife, Margaret. We were married for 33 years. She passed from cancer 6 years ago, and I want you to understand that when she died, this company is what kept me alive. I came to work every morning because she had believed in this place as much as I did, because she used to sit across from me at the kitchen table going over quarterly reports when we couldn't afford a real accountant. This company was both of ours, and then there was Daniel, my son, my only child. I brought him into the business when he was 26. He was sharp, I'll give him that. He had Margaret's eyes and her ability to walk into a room and make people feel immediately comfortable. He could charm a client in 20 minutes flat. I taught him everything else. How to read a balance sheet like it was telling you a story. How to negotiate without desperation. How to build trust with a vendor before you ever needed a favor. I spent 4 years mentoring him personally. By the time he was 32, I made him COO, my second in command. The heir to everything I'd built. I told myself that was a proud moment. And it was, for a while. The first thing I noticed was small enough that I almost talked myself out of even registering it. It was a Tuesday morning in March, about 18 months ago. I walked past the small glass conference room on the second floor, the one we always called the fishbowl because you could see straight through it from the hallway, and I saw Daniel sitting with 3 people I didn't recognize. 2 men in expensive suits, and a woman with a leather portfolio open on the table in front of her. The meeting looked serious, focused. Nobody was laughing or doing the friendly small talk you do at introductory meetings. These people looked comfortable with each other. I stopped in the hallway for a moment. Daniel's back was to the glass, but I could see his hands moving the way they do when he's making a point he wants to land. The 3 visitors were nodding. I didn't think too much of it. Daniel handled business development. He had meetings I didn't always know about. That was normal. That was the job. But then I noticed that when I mentioned it casually over lunch that day, "Saw you had a meeting this morning? Anyone I should know?" Daniel's answer was a little too smooth, too practiced. He said it was just a vendor exploring a new contract possibility, nothing worth bringing to my desk yet. He smiled when he said it, looked me right in the eyes. I believed him. That was my first mistake. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other things. Not big things, not anything I could point to and say, "That's the problem." Just a texture shift, a change in the feel of the office. Conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. A hesitation in how my assistant, Karen, answered my questions. She'd been with me for 11 years, and she had a very particular way of looking at her computer screen when she didn't want to look at me. I'd noticed it before, years ago, when she'd made an error she hadn't told me about yet. I was seeing that look again. I noticed that Daniel had started attending board meetings, quarterly check-ins with our 5-person advisory board with a different energy than usual. He used to defer to me in those rooms. That's just how it worked. I built those relationships. Those board members knew me. But lately, Daniel had been arriving early, staying after. walking out with board members to the elevator while I wrapped up paperwork, little things, positioning things. And then, one evening, about 6 weeks after that first fishbowl meeting, I was working late. The building was mostly empty. I needed a document from Daniel's office, an archived vendor contract from 2019 that I thought might be relevant to a dispute we were managing. His office was unlocked. I went in, found the filing drawer, started looking, and I found something I wasn't looking for. A folder. Not a vendor contract. A folder labeled with the name of a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside were several documents, but what stopped me cold was the first page. It was a preliminary shareholder restructuring memo. It outlined a scenario, a proposed scenario in which the founding shareholder of a company could be transitioned out of an active ownership role through a combination of board vote and a legal mechanism called a competency challenge. My name wasn't on it, but the company described matched ours in every way that mattered. Revenue figures, structure, industry classification, number of shareholders. I stood there in Daniel's office for a long time. The building was silent. The cleaning crew hadn't come through yet. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system. I put the folder back exactly where I found it. Then I went to my office, locked the door, and sat in the dark for 2 hours. Something was coming. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew it had already started. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling trying to convince myself I had misread what I saw. That the folder was something routine, maybe a case study someone had brought in, maybe research into a client situation. My mind wanted to find an explanation that didn't involve my son planning to remove me from my own company. But I've been in business for 30 years. I know what a restructuring memo looks like. I know what a competency challenge is. It's a legal mechanism used when majority shareholders want to push out an owner they claim is no longer fit to make decisions. Usually deployed in cases of severe illness, mental decline, or documented recklessness. It is not something you commission lightly. It is not casual paperwork. You don't hire a law firm to draft that kind of document for a hypothetical client case study. By morning, I had made a decision. I was not going to confront Daniel. Not yet. I was not going to change my behavior. I was not going to show him that anything was different. I was going to watch, quietly, carefully, and with absolute patience. I've always been a patient man. It's probably my best quality in business. I don't react. I observe. Then I move. The first thing I did was call an old friend, not a business contact. A personal friend of 20 years named Gerald Marsh, who happened to be one of the most respected corporate attorneys in the city. I didn't call him from my office phone. I used my personal cell. I drove to a coffee shop 3 blocks from my house and called him from the parking lot. I told Gerald I had a situation that needed to stay completely between us. I described the memo. I didn't tell him who it involved yet. I just described what I'd seen and asked him what it would mean in practice if someone were building that kind of case. Gerald went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Richard, for that mechanism to work, they would need at least 2 things. First, documented evidence of decision-making impairment or conduct unbecoming a fiduciary. Second, a majority shareholder vote or board approval. If you have 41% of the shares and your son has 22, they still need the board on their side." I thanked him and told him I'd be in touch. Then I sat in that parking lot, thinking about our 5-person advisory board. I thought about each member individually. I thought about their history with Daniel. I thought about Daniel arriving early to board meetings, staying late, walking people to the elevator. I thought about one member in particular, a man named Harris Welton. He had joined our advisory board 4 years ago at Daniel's recommendation. At the time, I'd approved the appointment because Harris had strong industry connections and Daniel had vouched for him enthusiastically. I didn't know Harris personally. I'd trusted Daniel's judgment. That was the second thing I trusted Daniel on that I was beginning to regret. I started keeping notes. A small leather notebook I kept in my jacket pocket and never left at the office. Every unusual thing I saw, I wrote it down with the date and time. I became methodical about it. I'm telling you this because what came next was too layered to carry in memory alone. I needed a record. The following week, I happened to be on the 6th floor visiting our technology team when I heard Daniel's voice from the partially open door of a nearby meeting room. I wasn't trying to listen. I genuinely wasn't. But I heard enough to stop walking. He was on the phone, he said, clearly, and without any particular effort to lower his voice. He won't see it coming. He trusts me completely. That's always been his weakness with me. He paused, then laughed quietly at something the other person said. Then he added, "Just make sure the paperwork is ready before the 15th. Once we have the board confirmed, it's over in one meeting." I kept walking, calmly, with the same pace I'd been using before I heard those words. I got into the elevator. I rode it down to the lobby. I walked outside and sat on a bench in front of the building in the cold March air. My heart was hammering. My hands were completely still in my lap. That disconnect between what I felt inside and what my body was doing has always been my version of control. It doesn't mean I wasn't shaken. I was devastated. I just refused to let it show. He trusts me completely. That's always been his weakness with me. My son said that about me, with amusement in his voice. I went back upstairs and spent the rest of the day working normally. I reviewed 3 contracts. I approved a vendor payment. I ate lunch at my desk. I smiled at Daniel when he stopped by to ask about a client call scheduled for the following morning. I told him to handle it with confidence and that I trusted his instincts. He smiled back. That same practiced, comfortable smile. That night, I called Gerald again. I told him I needed him to investigate the law firm named on that memo without making contact with them. I needed to know who they worked with, what they specialized in, and whether they had any existing connection to our company or to my son personally. I also told Gerald I needed to start thinking very carefully about my own position, my share structure, my legal protections, and any vulnerabilities Daniel might be trying to exploit. Gerald told me I needed to move carefully and quickly. He said if Daniel was planning to bring this to a board vote, the preparation for that kind of action usually meant they were already farther along than the paperwork suggested. That hit me hard, because it meant this hadn't started 6 weeks ago when I saw that fishbowl meeting. This might have been building for a year, maybe longer. Gerald then said something I wrote down in my notebook that night. The thing about a competency challenge is that it requires a paper trail of behavior. Richard, has anything unusual happened lately? Decisions that could be framed as erratic? Behavior that looks impulsive on paper? I thought about it, and then my stomach dropped. 6 months ago, I had authorized a significant discretionary expense on a client relationship project. It was my call, my signature, and it had been Daniel's suggestion. I'd approved it because I trusted him. The project had underperformed. I'd signed off on it. It was documented. 3 months ago, I had authorized a bid on a contract that we ultimately lost, and the losing bid had some language errors that had to be corrected twice before submission. I'd been traveling when those corrections happened and had approved the final version remotely, in a hurry, without reviewing it as carefully as I should have. Also documented. I thought about 2 other instances over the past year where I'd signed off on something that, if taken out of context, could be made to look like poor judgment or distraction. They hadn't been random. They'd been setups. Every single one of them had come from Daniel. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in the way real fear does, slowly, quietly, until it was sitting in the room with me and I couldn't pretend otherwise. My son hadn't just decided to betray me. He had spent a year building the case for it, crafting a narrative, creating a paper trail of events that, assembled by a skilled attorney in front of a sympathetic board, could paint me as a founder who was losing his grip, too old, too distracted, making costly decisions, a liability to the company's future. That was the story he was going to tell. And he had the receipts. I spent the next 3 days operating as if nothing had changed. I was professional, warm, engaged. I attended every meeting I was scheduled for. I asked Daniel thoughtful questions in front of staff. I showed up exactly the way a stable, sharp CEO was supposed to show up, because I knew if anyone was watching my behavior for ammunition, I was not going to give them a single frame they could use. But behind that calm, I was working. Gerald had come back to me with information about the law firm. They were called Vance & Crowe, and they specialized almost exclusively in corporate governance disputes, hostile restructurings, and shareholder rights litigation. They had represented the acquiring party in 4 separate hostile takeovers of family-owned businesses in the past 6 years. This was not a firm that drafted preliminary memos out of academic interest. Their file on us, and Gerald had confirmed through careful channels that a file on our company existed, had apparently been opened 14 months ago. 14 months. Daniel had been planning this for over a year before I found that folder. I sat with that number for a long time. 14 months ago, Daniel was coming to me for advice on handling difficult clients. 14 months ago, he was asking me to teach him how I approached long-term contract negotiation. He sat across from me at my own kitchen table and asked me how I'd built the relationships I had with our oldest clients. He took notes. He genuinely seemed grateful. And the whole time, Vance & Crowe had an open file with my name on it. I asked Gerald who the registered contact was at Vance & Crowe. He told me he'd been able to confirm that the primary client contact was not Daniel directly, it was Harris Welton. The board member Daniel had personally recommended 4 years ago. Harris Welton wasn't just a board appointment, he was the inside man. He'd been positioned on our board specifically to be the swing vote when the time came. I began to understand how big this actually was. It wasn't just Daniel wanting more control, or a son being impatient with a stubborn father. This was a structured corporate coup. Daniel and Harris had a plan, a law firm, a legal strategy, and at least one other board member we didn't yet know about. They were going to use a competency challenge to remove me, then restructure the shareholding so that Daniel's 22%, combined with whatever arrangement he'd made with Harris and any other cooperating board members, would give them effective control of the company. Once I was out, the company was theirs. Everything I'd built, everything Margaret and I had sacrificed for, transferred legally through a process I wouldn't even have had standing to contest easily once it was already in motion. I started building my own file. I began with the financials. I requested a full internal audit review, not unusual. I did this periodically, and I used it as an opportunity to dig into every transaction Daniel had authorized or recommended over the past 18 months. I wasn't looking for fraud. I was looking for patterns, and I found them. Every single suggested expenditure that had underperformed, every vendor contract that hadn't delivered, every project where my signature was on a problematic outcome. Daniel's fingerprints were on the front end. He'd brought the ideas. He'd framed the approvals. He'd made sure I was the one holding. It was elegant, honestly. If I hadn't been looking for it, I would never have seen it. Gerald helped me understand how to document this in a legally useful way. Not just observation, but a formal record showing the chain of recommendation, approval, and outcome for each of those transactions. Showing that the origin point was always Daniel. Showing a deliberate pattern, not coincidence. At the same time, I reached out quietly to the 3 board members I was most confident about. Not to tell them what was happening, I wasn't ready for that yet, but to reconnect. To have genuine conversations about the company, about our direction, about how they felt we were positioned. I needed to know where I actually stood, whether Harris had already been working on them. 2 of those conversations told me everything was fine. These were board members who had known me for over a decade, who responded with their usual candor and warmth, who didn't seem to be carrying anything unusual in the conversation. The 3rd conversation was different. A board member named Elaine Torres, a woman I'd known for 9 years, who had always been measured and principled, was noticeably careful with her words. She was pleasant, but guarded. She didn't volunteer anything. When I mentioned that I felt the company was in a very strong position going forward, she nodded but didn't echo the sentiment. She just said that there were always interesting conversations happening at the board level, that things were evolving. Interesting conversations. Things were evolving. That was Elaine telling me, as diplomatically as she could, that she had been approached. That she was in the middle of something she wasn't going to discuss with me. She wasn't malicious, but she also wasn't going to warn me. She was sitting on the fence, watching to see which way this would fall. So Harris and Daniel had at least 2 board members, possibly 3 including themselves, but Harris wasn't a shareholder, so he only had board influence, not a vote. Still, if they had 3 of the 5 advisory board members willing to recommend action, and if Vance and Crow had built a credible competency file, they could force a board resolution that would create enormous legal and reputational pressure on me. The key vulnerability I had: I owned 1% of the shares, but I did not have an absolute majority. The remaining 59% was distributed between Daniel's 22, Harris's non-shareholder position, 2 independent investors who held about 15% combined, and the rest in a small employee ownership pool. If the independent investors could be convinced that the company's leadership was unstable, if they believed the competency narrative, they could vote with Daniel and create a majority that would override me. That was the plan. That was the whole architecture. And the meeting where it was all going to happen? Gerald confirmed it through his contacts at Vance & Crow's external filing office. There was a special board session scheduled, 14 days away. 14 days. I sat in my car that night in the office parking garage long after everyone had left. I thought about the first time I ever brought Daniel to this building. He was 14 years old. I took him on a Saturday when the place was empty, walked him around every floor, showed him every office. He stood at my window looking out at the city, and I told him that one day all of this would be his. I had meant it as a gift. He had apparently been taking notes. I wiped my face and started the car. I had 14 days, and for the first time since I'd found that folder in his office, I wasn't afraid. I was focused. They had been building a case against me. Now I was going to build one back. 14 days is not a lot of time, but I've closed major contracts in less. I've saved collapsing vendor relationships with a single well-timed phone call. I've made decisions that changed the direction of this company in the space of an afternoon. Time pressure is not something that breaks me. It clarifies me. The first thing I did was meet with Gerald in person. Not at his office, too visible, too traceable, if Daniel had anyone watching my movements. We met at a private dining room at a restaurant Gerald had used for sensitive client meetings before. I brought every piece of documentation I had assembled. The audit findings, the transaction records with Daniel's recommendation trail attached, the dated notes from my leather pocket notebook, the timeline of the events as I understood them, and a written account of the conversation I'd overheard on the 6th floor, which I had recorded a version of, because after that day I had started carrying a digital recorder in my jacket pocket. You should know this is legal in my state for single-party consent situations. I had documented everything properly because Gerald had made clear that anything I planned to use needed to be obtained correctly. Gerald reviewed everything for 2 hours across that table. When he was done, he looked up and said, "Richard, this is not a small case. What they've built against you is serious, but what you've built in response is better." He believed we had enough to do several things. First, to preemptively challenge the competency filing by demonstrating that the underlying behavioral evidence had been manufactured through deliberate manipulation of the recommendation chain. Second, to open an internal investigation into Daniel's conduct as COO, which I still had the authority to initiate as founder and majority shareholder, that would create immediate legal complications for the board proceeding. Third, and most importantly, to protect the 2 independent investors from being influenced before they understood the full picture. That third point was the most urgent. If Daniel's team reached the independent investors first and convinced them the company was in crisis, the shareholder vote could go badly regardless of what I had on Daniel personally. So Gerald drafted a formal letter on my behalf, a shareholder communication, which I was entitled to send that outlined material information relevant to their investment. It didn't accuse anyone by name. It stated factually that there was an active governance dispute, that legal counsel had been retained, and that a full briefing would be available to shareholders upon request before any pending board action. Sending that letter forced the situation into a different legal framework. It meant the board couldn't proceed with a surprise vote without acknowledging that shareholders had already been put on notice of a dispute. Any vote taken without that disclosure could be challenged as procedurally improper. Both independent investors responded within 24 hours requesting the full briefing. I met with them separately. I brought Gerald. I showed them the transaction trail. I showed them the pattern of manufactured evidence. I showed them Vance and Crow's involvement and the timeline confirming the case had been opened 14 months ago, before any of the problematic decisions that file cited had even occurred. I explained calmly that what they were being presented with was not a genuine governance concern. It was a coordinated effort to transfer ownership using legal process as a weapon. One of the investors, a methodical man named Frank Altieri who had known me for 8 years, asked me a very direct question. "Richard, what do you want to happen here?" I told him, "I want the truth on the table, in front of everyone, at the same meeting where they plan to use it against me." He nodded slowly. He said, "Then we're with you." The second investor, a firm run by a woman named Claire Sung who rarely attended board meetings in person but paid very close attention to everything, sent a message through her representative that said simply, "We support the founding shareholders' right to a fair hearing. We will be present at the scheduled meeting." Both of them in my corner. Now I had enough shareholder support to block any vote Daniel tried to call, but that wasn't the same as winning. Blocking a vote just meant a standoff. I needed this resolved permanently. I needed Daniel's plan exposed in a way that closed the door on it completely, legally and reputationally. That meant I needed what happened at that board meeting to be undeniable. Gerald and I spent the next several days preparing a presentation. Not an emotional appeal, not a personal statement about betrayal or hurt. A clean, factual, document-backed corporate presentation showing the timeline, the patterns, the law firm's involvement, the manufactured evidence, and a clear legal analysis of what had been attempted. Every claim sourced, every document attached. Organized the way I organize everything. Logically, completely, without gaps. I also did something that I want to explain carefully, because it matters. I did not tell Daniel that I knew. I continued showing up to work. I continued treating him normally. I continued letting him believe that everything was proceeding on schedule, that I had no idea, that the meeting in 4 days was going to go the way he had planned it. That was hard. I want you to understand how hard that was. Every time I looked at him across a conference table or passed him in the hallway, I was carrying everything I knew. Every morning, I had to make the active decision to keep my face neutral, my voice steady, my behavior unremarkable. Because if he sensed anything, if he picked up even a tremor of what was coming, he might accelerate or pivot or reach out to the investors before my letters had fully landed. So I performed. I performed the role of a man who trusted his son, who was looking forward to the upcoming board meeting, who had no idea that the meeting had been designed as the instrument of his destruction. I even had lunch with Daniel 2 days before. He ordered the salmon. He talked about a new client relationship he was nurturing. He asked me what I thought the company's 5-year growth plan should prioritize. I gave him a thoughtful, detailed answer. He listened carefully. He seemed genuinely engaged. I wondered, watching him across the table, whether he had ever actually loved this company or whether it had always just been something he planned to take. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure I ever will. On the morning of the scheduled board meeting, I arrived early. Earlier than I had ever arrived to a board meeting, I arranged the room myself. I placed printed folders at each seat, presentation materials, all properly organized. I had one additional folder that I placed face down in front of my own chair. I said good morning to Karen, who looked at me with those careful eyes. I nodded at her. She pressed her lips together and looked away. Gerald arrived at 8:30 and took a seat along the back wall, as outside legal counsel. This was my right as a shareholder. He was there in an advisory capacity. No one could object. Frank Altieri and Claire Sung's representative arrived together at 8:45. They sat on my side of the table. Daniel walked in at 9. He was wearing a charcoal suit I hadn't seen before. His hair was perfect. He looked like a man who was about to give the presentation of his life. He saw Gerald. His stride slowed for just a fraction of a second. He saw Frank and Claire's representative. Something passed across his face too fast for most people to catch, but I've been reading people for 30 years. It was the flicker of a man realizing something might be off. He recovered immediately. He sat down at the far end of the table with Harris Welton beside him. Harris looked confident, prepared, a man with an agenda he expected to execute. The board chair called the meeting to order. Harris moved immediately to put a special resolution on the agenda. The chair acknowledged it, and then I spoke. I said calmly, "Before we proceed with any special resolution, I'd like to present material information to the board and our attending shareholders. This presentation is relevant to any pending action and is being submitted formally into the meeting record." I flipped open the folder in front of me and began. The room did not react the way you might imagine. When you picture a big confrontation, you think of raised voices and sudden chaos, people jumping to their feet and pointing fingers. That's not what happened. What happened was much quieter and, in some ways, much more devastating. I presented for 40 minutes. Methodically, chronologically, I started with the date the Vance and Crowe file was opened 14 months ago, and I compared it against the timeline of events they had used to build their competency case. I showed the board in sequence every transaction that had been used as evidence of my alleged poor judgment. Then I showed the recommendation trail behind each one. Daniel's emails, Daniel's internal memos, Daniel's meeting summaries recommending those exact courses of action and requesting my approval. The pattern was not ambiguous. You would have to willfully choose not to see it. I showed them the shareholder communication protocol I had followed. I showed them the formal responses from both independent investors confirming they had been briefed. I showed them the legal analysis Gerald had prepared, which explained, in plain language, that a competency challenge built on evidence manufactured by the party initiating the challenge constituted potential fraud on the board. And then I placed one additional document on the table, a single file. I set it down without comment and let it sit there. It was a certified copy of the full Vance and Crowe engagement letter. Gerald had obtained it through a third-party legal channel. Entirely properly, entirely admissible. It listed Daniel Calloway as the directing client. It listed Harris Welton as the co-instructing party. It listed the scope of work to prepare documentation supporting a competency challenge against the founding shareholder of Callaway Industrial Solutions, with the ultimate objective of facilitating a governance restructuring that would transfer effective control to the co-instructing parties. That was the sentence that changed the room. Effective control. To the co-instructing parties. Harris had never been a neutral board member. He had been Daniel's partner in this from the beginning. The advisory board seat Daniel had secured for him 4 years ago was not a talent acquisition for the company's benefit. It was an investment in a future plan to take the company away from me. When I finished presenting, I looked around the room and then I looked at Daniel. He was completely still. His face was an expression I had never seen on him before, a kind of controlled blankness that I recognized as a person trying very hard not to let anything show. He had Margaret's discipline in that way. But beneath the surface, I could see the absolute stillness of a man who understood that the ground had moved. Harris had turned slightly pale. His hands were flat on the table. He was staring at the Vance and Crowe letter like he was deciding whether to dispute it. Elaine Torres, the board member who had given me the carefully guarded answer about interesting conversations, had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at the center of the table. She didn't look at Daniel. She didn't look at me. She was processing something privately. The board chair asked if Daniel or Harris wished to respond to any of the presented information. Daniel said nothing for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "I'd like to request a recess." I said, "Of course." We recessed. Gerald and I stepped into the corridor. Gerald said nothing. We stood quietly for about 10 minutes. From inside the room, I could hear the low murmur of voices but not the words. When we reconvened, Harris Welton made a statement. He said he would be resigning from the advisory board effective immediately. He thanked the company for the experience. He did not address a single word of what had been presented. He gathered his materials, stood, shook no one's hand, and left the room. What happened next was the thing that I won't ever entirely describe to you, because it felt too personal for a room full of people. Daniel asked to speak to me privately, outside the meeting, before anything else proceeded. We went to my office. The same office I'd sat in for 30 years. The same view. The same desk. He stood near the window, the same window he'd stood at as a 14-year-old boy, and he looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough." He asked if I was going to pursue legal action against him personally. I told him that depended entirely on what happened next. What happened next was that Daniel resigned as COO in writing. That same day, the resignation was quiet, without any stated reason, effective at the end of the month. Gerald negotiated the terms directly. Daniel's shares in the company were placed in a restricted trust for a period of 5 years, during which he could not vote them or transfer them. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue a civil fraud claim against him personally, though I made absolutely clear that should any future attempt be made to challenge my position in this company, in any form, through any party, the full evidence package would be filed in civil court the following morning. He agreed to all of it. I also reported the full situation with documentation to our state's corporate governance oversight body not to destroy Daniel, but because Harris Welton had participated in a scheme to commit fraud on a board, and that required disclosure. Harris was later barred from serving as a corporate director or officer in our state for 7 years. The Vance and Crowe engagement was terminated. Their bill was never paid by anyone on our side. Elaine Torres remained on the board. She came to my office 2 weeks after the meeting, and she told me, very simply, that she was sorry. She said she had been presented with a version of events that made the situation sound very different from what it actually was, and that she had not done enough to push back on it or to come to me directly. She said she should have. I told her I appreciated her honesty. I meant it. I kept her on the board because I believe people make mistakes under pressure that they don't make otherwise, and Elaine had ultimately done nothing other than listen to a compelling story without full information. That is a very human thing to do. I won't tell you that any of this was clean or simple. It was not. The weeks that followed were strange and quiet in a way that I didn't entirely know how to navigate. The company continued. Our staff came to work. Our clients stayed. Our contracts were honored. From the outside, nothing had changed. A senior executive had departed quietly. Happens in business all the time. But inside, I was sitting with something very heavy. I had built this company partly as a legacy for Daniel. That had always been at the back of my mind, that everything I was doing was being layered down for someone who would carry it forward after me. That belief had shaped decisions I'd made for years, and now that belief was simply gone. Not wounded, not complicated, just gone. Like a room I had always assumed was there that I walked toward one day and found only a wall. I don't tell you this to get your sympathy. I'm past the point where I need it. I tell you because the emotional reality of what happened to me was not about a boardroom. It was about a father realizing that the relationship he thought he had with his son was partly a performance, and that the performance had been running for a very long time. That is not something you get over in a few months. That is something you carry and reorganize yourself around, slowly, the way you adapt to a change in weight. What I can tell you is that I went back to work every day. I reviewed the structure of the company with fresh eyes, because I realized that over the years I had organized things in ways that made sense when the person next to me was someone I trusted unconditionally. I made the company more structurally resilient. I distributed responsibility more carefully. I put proper governance structures in place that I had always deferred on because they felt like a bureaucratic insult to a family business. They were not an insult. They were protection. I know that now. I promoted 3 people who had been doing exceptional work quietly for years without enough recognition. I brought in 2 new board members, both independently recommended through a formal search, both vetted by Gerald, neither of them connected to anyone with a personal stake in our ownership structure. I restructured my own share position in a way that legally protected the company from any future similar attempt. And I hired a new COO. A woman named Sandra Park who had spent 15 years building operations teams from the ground up and who had exactly the kind of direct, no-nonsense mind that I responded to. In our first meeting, she told me 3 things that were wrong with our current vendor structure that I hadn't noticed. I liked her immediately. 6 months after that board meeting, I sat in my office at the end of a regular workday and I looked at the city through the window and I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. Something that was not exactly peace, but was close to it. Something that comes when you have walked through a fire and come out the other side still holding everything that actually mattered. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would have made of all of this. She would have been angry in a way that I never am. She carried heat for people she loved, and she would have burned about it for weeks. But she also would have sat across from me at the kitchen table eventually and said something practical and cutting and exactly right, and then she would have poured coffee and told me to stop brooding and get back to work. So that is what I did. The company I built still stands. It carries my name. It employs 222 people now, 8 more than the day of that meeting. We posted our strongest quarterly revenue in 11 years 4 months ago. We have 3 new long-term contracts in the pipeline and a client roster that is more stable than it has been in years. I am still here. I am still the owner. And the file on the table? I have kept a copy of that full presentation in my office, in a locked drawer. Not as a trophy, not as a wound I revisit. I keep it as a reminder that the most important thing I built in 30 years was not the company itself. It was the discipline to stay calm when the world was on fire. The patience to gather truth before acting on it. The willingness to stand in a room full of people who expected me to fall and instead place a single document on a table and let it speak. That discipline is not something anyone can take from you. Not a law firm, not a board resolution, not even a son who decided that your trust was a weakness he could use. It is the thing that remains when everything else has been challenged. And for me, after everything, it was enough.